Imagine holding a book that changed the world, a handwritten account so extraordinary, it shattered Europe's medieval ignorance and opened the door to an entire continent. Marco Polo's Journey Notes are more than just travel logs. They're a puzzle box of historical clues, each one revealing secrets about a world most Europeans couldn't even fathom. For centuries, his descriptions of the East, its dazzling cities, advanced technologies, and powerful rulers were met with disbelief. Yet hidden within those pages were truths so profound, they rewrote history. What if I told you that even today, historians are still unraveling the mysteries tucked between his words? This isn't just a story about a merchant's adventure. It's about how one man's observations bridged two worlds, sparking an era of exploration that would reshape the globe. Marco Polo's notes didn't just describe the Mongol Empire's grandeur. They contained subtle, almost accidental clues, details about trade routes, cultural practices, and political intrigues that historians now recognize as priceless snapshots of a lost era. Some of these clues were so unexpected, they challenged everything Europe thought it knew. For example, his accounts of paper money, coal burning, and even the Great Wall were initially dismissed as fantastical lies. But time proved him right, and that's what makes his writings so fascinating. They're not just a window into the past, they're a mirror reflecting how much we still have to learn. So what are the most compelling clues hidden in Marco Polo's journey? From his startling encounters with Kublai Khan's court to his cryptic mentions of lands even modern maps struggle to pinpoint, we're about to dive into the 20 most important historical revelations from his notes. These aren't just dry facts, they're pieces of a grand puzzle that connect medieval Europe to the heart of Asia. And the first clue, it's something that left scholars stunned for generations: Marco Polo's first-hand account of the Mongol Empire's military strategies, which were so advanced they defied European understanding. But that's just the beginning. Stick around, because what comes next will transport you straight into the pages of one of history's greatest adventures. Marco Polo's descriptions of Kublai Khan's court weren't just travel anecdotes, they were seismic revelations that shattered Europe's narrow worldview. Picture this: a palace so vast, its walls shimmered with gold leaf, its floors lined with silk carpets, and its halls buzzing with officials managing an empire that stretched from the Pacific to the Black Sea. Polo wrote of a ruler who wielded power with precision, overseeing a bureaucracy so efficient it made Europe's feudal chaos look primitive. The Mongols, long dismissed as ruthless barbarians, were revealed to be master administrators, running a government that valued merit over birthright. With a postal system so fast, riders could relay messages across thousands of miles in days. But perhaps the most startling detail was Kublai Khan's religious tolerance. In an era when Europe was tearing itself apart over faith, Polo described a court where Buddhists, Muslims, Christians, and Taoists debated freely, protected by a Khan who welcomed diverse beliefs. Historians like John Lana note that these accounts forced Europeans to confront their own prejudices, revealing a civilization far more sophisticated than their own. One quote from Polo's notes captures it perfectly: "The great Khan's majesty is such that no sovereign in the world can rival him in wealth, power, or justice." Yet Polo wasn't just an observer, he became part of this machine. His fluency in Mongolian and Persian earned him a role as Kublai Khan's envoy, a position that gave him unprecedented access to secrets most foreigners never saw. And that's where the next clue begins, because Polo's diplomatic missions weren't just about delivering messages. They were cover for something far more intriguing: Marco Polo's role as Kublai Khan's envoy, was far more than a ceremonial title. It was a backstage pass to the inner workings of the Mongol Empire's shadow diplomacy. While his writings paint vivid scenes of palace banquets and hunting expeditions, read between the lines and you'll find whispers of something far more clandestine. Polo himself drops tantalizing hints, mentioning journeys to distant provinces under the guise of official business, where he observed much that was worthy of note. Modern historians like David Morgan argue these vague phrases likely masked espionage missions, gathering intelligence on rebel factions or assessing loyalties in far-flung territories. One of his most intriguing assignments, the secret negotiations with the rival Ilkhanate in Persia, a delicate dance of diplomacy where Polo's fluency in multiple languages made him indispensable. His notes describe carrying golden tablets, the Khan's personal seal, granting him safe passage and authority to speak on the empire's behalf. But here's where scholars split. Some, like Francis Wood, question whether a young Venetian merchant truly held such sway, suggesting Polo embellished his importance. Yet archaeological evidence backs his claims, like the discovery of similar diplomatic tablets in Mongolia, matching his descriptions down to the intricate tiger head engravings. What's undeniable is how these missions gave Polo a front-row seat to the Silk Road's best-kept secrets. He documented covert trade deals for spices and silks, noting how Mongol officials manipulated markets by stockpiling goods, an early form of economic warfare. His accounts of hidden mountain passes and alternative routes became literal treasure maps for later explorers. But perhaps the most startling revelation was yet to come, because woven into these tales of diplomacy and spycraft were encounters with technologies so advanced they seemed like magic to European eyes. Take his description of the Khan's black stones that burned hotter than would a clear reference to coal, a fuel source Europe wouldn't adopt for centuries. Or the paper currency system, which Polo called the cunning of the Great Khan, where mulberry bark notes held more value than gold. These weren't just curiosities, they were glimpses of an industrial revolution happening half a world away. Among all the technological wonders Marco Polo witnessed in the East, nothing baffled or terrified European readers more than his descriptions of the Mongols' explosive weapons. He called them fire that leaps forth with thunder, detailing how Kublai Khan's armies used bamboo tubes to hurl projectiles that could blow men to pieces. These were the earliest recorded accounts of gunpowder artillery in the West, and they sent shockwaves through medieval Europe. Yet here's where the mystery deepens. Polo's notes carefully avoid explaining how these devices work. Some scholars, like Jack Weatherford, argue this was deliberate, a Venetian merchant protecting lucrative trade secrets. After all, gunpowder recipes were worth more than gold, and Polo's family had investments in the very trade routes that might be disrupted if Europe replicated Mongol weapons. The controversy doesn't end there. While Polo's writings mention gunpowder's military use, he never describes its chemical composition, a glaring omission that fueled centuries of skepticism. Detractors like Francis would point out that Persian and Arabic texts from the same era give far more technical details, suggesting Polo might have only seen demonstrations rather than understood the science. But recent discoveries support his account. Archaeologists excavating Mongol battle sites in Hungary found traces of potassium nitrate in soil layers dating to the 13th century, physical proof that gunpowder technology reached Europe earlier than previously thought, likely through the very Silk Road networks Polo traveled. What's undeniable is the seismic impact these passages had. Within decades of Polo's death, European armies were experimenting with primitive cannons, kickstarting an arms race that would redefine warfare. The irony, Polo's guarded descriptions may have slowed this process, forcing European alchemists to rediscover gunpowder's formula through trial and error. Yet this wasn't the only secret he carried home. Hidden between lines about warfare and politics were equally astonishing reports of creatures that seemed to defy nature itself, like the Khan's private zoo, where Polo claimed to have seen elephants draped in cloth of gold and a beast with the body of a deer but the horns of a unicorn. To modern readers, that last detail screams rhinoceros, but for medieval Europeans, it was proof that the East held wonders beyond even gunpowder's destructive power. Marco Polo's encounters with exotic animals weren't just footnotes in his travels. They were moments that exposed the vast gulf between medieval Europe's imagination and the realities of the natural world. Take his description of a creature with the body of a deer but the horns of a unicorn. To modern eyes, that's unmistakably a rhinoceros, but to Polo's European readers, it was proof that mythical beasts roamed the East. His accounts of crocodiles, which he called dragons with great teeth, only deepened the confusion. These weren't just innocent misunderstandings, they were clues to how little Europe knew about global biodiversity. For centuries, scholars clung to these fantastical interpretations, even illustrating unicorns in bestiaries based on Polo's vague descriptions. What's fascinating isn't just the mistakes themselves, but why they persisted so stubbornly. Europe's zoological knowledge was shackled by ancient texts like Pliny the Elder's Natural History, which mixed fact with folklore. When Polo described a rhinoceros's single horn, it fit neatly into existing myths about unicorns, creatures already symbolizing purity in Christian art. The irony, Polo was arguably more accurate than his critics. He noted the rhino's thick, hideous skin and aggressive temperament, details absent from European lore. Yet because his reports clashed with entrenched beliefs, they were either dismissed or twisted to fit preconceptions. This pattern repeated with other animals. His mention of crocodiles basking on riverbanks sparked debates about whether dragons were real, while his offhand remark about giant serpents in India, likely pythons, fed legends of man-eating monsters. Even his passing reference to the Khan's war elephants, draped in silk and armor, was met with skepticism. How could beasts so massive be tamed? Yet these weren't just tales for entertainment. Polo's animal encounters hinted at something deeper: the ecological diversity of the Mongol Empire, where zoos showcased creatures from every corner of their domains as living symbols of imperial reach. But while Europe fixated on unicorns and dragons, Polo quietly recorded something far more revolutionary: an innovation that would eventually transform global economics. Nestled between accounts of exotic beasts was his stunned description of Kublai Khan's paper money, a system so alien to Europe that it sounded like sorcery. The Great Khan causes bark to be made into something like paper, he wrote, marveling at how these notes could purchase anything from silk to spices. This wasn't just currency, it was a glimpse of a financial system centuries ahead of Europe's coin-based economy. And unlike the rhinos misunderstood as unicorns, this revelation would ignite a chain reaction that reshaped the modern world. Marco Polo's description of Kublai Khan's paper money system reads like something out of a fantasy novel, except it was all terrifyingly real. Picture the scene. A merchant hands over a single piece of mulberry bark paper stamped with the Khan's seal, and suddenly, it's accepted as payment for anything from a sack of rice to a chest of jewels. To medieval Europeans who lugged around heavy coins of silver and gold, this sounded like pure alchemy. Polo's notes capture their shock perfectly. All his subjects receive it without hesitation. He wrote, marveling at how these flimsy slips could command more respect than precious metal. What seemed like magic was actually a stroke of economic genius, a centralized currency system that stabilized trade across an empire spanning 12 million square miles. The genius lay in the details. Polo observed how the Khan's government controlled the money supply, burning old notes to prevent inflation and punishing counterfeiters with death. This wasn't just currency, it was a tool of empire. Historian Janet Abu-Lughod notes that Mongol rulers used paper money to bind distant regions together, forcing subjects to accept it as legal tender while hoarding gold and silver for state reserves. The system was so effective, Chinese merchants could travel thousands of miles without worrying about exchange rates, a concept unimaginable in fragmented Europe, where every duchy minted its own coins. Yet Polo's account left out one critical fact: how often the system failed. Later scholars uncovered records of hyperinflation under later Yuan emperors, when reckless printing turned paper money into worthless scraps. This omission hints at Polo's delicate position, praising the Khan's brilliance while avoiding criticism that might offend his patrons. Still, the seed was planted. Within centuries, European banks like the Medici were experimenting with promissory notes, and by the 1600s, Sweden became the first Western nation to adopt paper currency outright. The irony: while Europe hailed these innovations as revolutionary, they were essentially reinventing a system the Mongols had perfected, and Marco Polo had documented 400 years earlier. But for all the astonishment over paper money, Polo saved his most tantalizing clue for last. Buried deep in his notes lies a fleeting reference to a land even more mysterious than China, a place he called Sipangu, where palaces were roofed in solid gold. That single paragraph would ignite Europe's obsession with Japan, sending explorers scrambling to decode his cryptic directions and the truth behind that clue. It's stranger than anything Polo could have invented when Marco Polo scribbled those tantalizing lines about Sipangu. He unwittingly lit a fire under Europe's imagination that would burn for centuries. Describing islands where the palaces are roofed with fine gold, he painted a vision of Japan so lavish, it made even Kublai Khan's empire seem modest by comparison. But here's where historians hit a snag. Polo's account is suspiciously thin. He claims to have visited during a failed Mongol invasion, yet his descriptions of Japanese customs are vague, recycled from Chinese gossip about dog-faced men and pearl diving rituals. Scholars like Ronald Latham argue this proves Polo never set foot there, while others, like Stephen Hoare, point to his accurate mention of the Kuroshio current, a detail only a sailor would know. The real impact wasn't in the accuracy, though. It was in the obsession Polo's words spawned. His rough coordinates claiming Japan lay 1,500 miles east of China convinced Columbus he could reach Asia by sailing west, a miscalculation that accidentally reshaped world history. The irony: Polo's golden roofs likely referred to the gilded temples of Kyoto, but European mapmakers took it literally, marking Sipangu as a literal El Dorado on early charts. Even the name itself was a clue lost in translation. Sipangu, derived from the Chinese Ribanguo, meaning land of the rising sun. Yet for all the myths, Polo's brief nod to Japan pales next to another revelation in his notes, one that saved lives rather than sparking gold rushes. Tucked between tales of conquest and commerce are meticulous observations of Eastern medicine, from acupuncture to herbal remedies that left European physicians baffled. He described surgeons stitching wounds with silk threads, pharmacists compounding drugs from rare roots, and hospitals, yes, hospitals where the poor received free care. In a Europe still bleeding patients to balance humors, these were nothing short of revolutionary, and the most surprising part, Polo didn't dismiss them as exotic curiosities. He wrote with the awe of a man witnessing the future. Marco Polo's notes on Eastern medicine read like a revelation ripped from the future. While European doctors were still prescribing leeches and praying over plagues, he described a world where surgeons stitched wounds with sterilized silk, where herbalists compounded drugs from ginseng and rhubarb roots, and where hospitals funded by the state offered free care to the poor. One passage details a Chinese physician using a powdered mushroom to stop bleeding, a technique modern research now links to the anticoagulant properties of certain fungi. Polo didn't just observe these practices, he participated, recounting how Mongol healers treated his fever with a bitter tea made from willow bark centuries before Europe isolated salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin. The true shock wasn't just the sophistication of these methods, but how openly they were shared. Polo wrote of medical texts translated across languages, of Persian doctors studying acupuncture in Beijing, and of Hindu physicians exchanging remedies with Tibetan monks. This was a medical Silk Road, buzzing with knowledge that wouldn't reach Europe until the Renaissance. Historian Valerie Hansen notes that Polo's accounts of mercury-based syphilis treatments, while horrifying by modern standards, show how empirical experimentation, not just dogma, drove Eastern medicine. Yet Europe dismissed these clues for generations, clinging to Galen's ancient theories about imbalanced humors. But Polo's medical observations weren't his only hidden gifts to the West. Tucked between descriptions of herbal cures and surgical tools was an even more explosive revelation: sketches of coastlines and trade routes, hastily drawn on mulberry paper. These were the lost maps that would later fuel the age of exploration. Charts so accurate, scholars suspect they were copied from secret Mongol archives. And one in particular held a secret that would rewrite geography. Marco Polo's lost maps might be one of history's greatest what-ifs. He boasted of carrying detailed charts, drawn on delicate mulberry paper, that plotted every oasis, mountain pass, and pirate-infested strait along the Silk Road. Imagine the sheer strategic value of those documents, not just trade routes but notations on seasonal winds, safe harbors, and the locations of freshwater springs in the Gobi Desert. Had they survived, they could have shaved decades off Europe's stumbling attempts to navigate Asia. Instead, they vanished, leaving scholars to piece together clues from scattered references in his notes. Polo himself hinted at their importance, writing that Kublai Khan's couriers relied on similar maps to cross lands where no Christian had ever trod. The ripple effect of their disappearance can't be overstated. Without these guides, European cartographers like Fra Mauro were forced to rely on hearsay, stitching together fragments of traveler accounts into maps riddled with blank spaces and mythical creatures. Compare that to the precision of the Kangnido map, a 14th century Korean chart, likely based on Mongol sources, which accurately depicted Africa's shape centuries before Portuguese explorers rounded the Cape of Good Hope. Polo's maps might have bridged that gap, offering a head start in the race for global trade. Some historians, like Peter Whitfield, argue they could even have prevented tragedies like the doomed voyage of Niccolo da Conti, who wandered for years in search of routes Polo had already documented. Yet there's a tantalizing twist. Recent digitization projects have revealed faint traces of ink on pages once dismissed as blank, suggesting Polo's original manuscripts may have contained sketches later scrubbed away by cautious scribes. Infrared scans of one Venetian copy showed ghostly outlines of coastlines beneath the text, sparking debates about whether these are remnants of his famed maps or mere marginalia. Either way, their absence forced Europe to rediscover the East the hard way through trial and error. But if Polo's maps were a road to understanding, his observations on faith were a bridge. Amidst the trade, goods, and geography, he recorded something even more radical for medieval Europe, a continent where religions coexisted without bloodshed. His accounts of Buddhist monks debating Muslim scholars in Kublai Khan's court, or Nestorian Christians praying alongside Taoist healers, didn't just describe tolerance, they quietly challenged the very idea of religious war. And that revelation would shake Europe to its core. Marco Polo's description of religious tolerance in the Mongol Empire wasn't just a travel anecdote, it was a direct challenge to medieval Europe's darkest assumptions. While knights and priests waged bloody crusades against infidels, Polo wrote of Kublai Khan's court as a place where Buddhist monks, Muslim scholars, and Nestorian Christians debated philosophy without fear of persecution. The great Khan has declared that there are 4 prophets worthy of reverence, he noted, listing Muhammad, Jesus, Moses, and Buddha as equally respected figures. To European readers, this wasn't just surprising, it was heresy, yet Polo's matter-of-fact tone suggested something radical, that coexistence wasn't just possible but practical for governing a vast empire. The ripple effects of this revelation were slow but seismic. Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire and Leibniz later seized on Polo's accounts as proof that religious unity wasn't necessary for political stability. Voltaire's I sur les Moeurs even cited Kublai Khan as a model of enlightened rule, contrasting Mongol tolerance with Europe's sectarian violence. Historian Jack Weatherford argues these passages quietly undermine the Church's authority, planting early seeds of secularism. But Polo wasn't just a passive observer, he participated in this pluralism. His notes describe attending Buddhist ceremonies, exchanging gifts with Muslim merchants, and even helping Nestorian Christians translate prayers. Each interaction subtly reinforced the idea that faith didn't have to divide societies, yet for all its idealism, Polo's account had a pragmatic edge. He noted how Kublai Khan used religious tolerance as a tool of statecraft, appointing Muslim administrators to govern Buddhist regions and vice versa, a system designed to prevent any single group from gaining too much power. This wasn't just harmony, it was strategy. Modern scholars like Mikkel Buren see parallels in today's multicultural policies, proving the Mongols' approach was centuries ahead of its time. But just when the picture seems idyllic, Polo drops a bombshell. Amidst tales of interfaith dialogue, he mentions a remote tribe in the mountains of Yunnan who eat the flesh of their enemies. This fleeting reference to cannibalism, likely a distorted account of ritual practices, serves as a stark reminder that Polo's world wasn't just about enlightenment. It was a place where the unimaginable coexisted with the extraordinary, where the Khan's golden court cast shadows over mysteries even Marco couldn't fully explain. And that's where the next clue begins. Marco Polo's description of Sumatra's so-called man-eating tribes wasn't just a sensational detour, it was a calculated clue about the limits of cross-cultural understanding. His graphic accounts of warriors who eat the flesh of their enemies struck medieval readers as pure horror fiction, yet centuries later, anthropologists uncovered startling parallels. The Batak people of northern Sumatra, for instance, practiced ritual cannibalism as late as the 1800s, consuming slain foes to absorb their strength, a custom Polo may have witnessed or heard described secondhand. But why include such jarring details in an otherwise diplomatic travelogue? The answer lies in Polo's role as both merchant and storyteller. These passages weren't just shock value, they were a deliberate contrast to the Mongol sophistication, reminding Europe that the East contained multitudes, from glittering cities to societies operating by utterly alien rules. Critics like Francis would argue Polo exaggerated to entertain his audience, pointing out his vague phrasing. They say these people devour. Yet Dutch colonial records confirm Batak rituals involving ceremonial consumption of criminals' hearts, while Chinese chronicles from the same era describe Sumatran tribes keeping trophies of defeated enemies. Polo's account, though sensationalized, likely stemmed from real encounters or trusted local sources. The deeper truth, these passages reveal how Polo filtered unfamiliar cultures through a medieval European lens. When he described tribesmen wearing necklaces of teeth, he framed it as barbarism, missing its spiritual significance, much like his mislabeling of rhinos as unicorns. Yet for all the focus on cannibalism, Polo's notes on Sumatra hold an even more surprising revelation. Nestled between tales of ritual warfare is a single line about the island's capital, Samudera, a city so well ordered, its streets run straight as arrows with canals like Venice. This fleeting observation bridges the sensational and the sublime, hinting at a sophistication Europe wouldn't match for centuries. And that's where the real treasure lies, not in the myths of man-eaters, but in Polo's accidental documentation of urban planning so advanced, it would inspire Renaissance architects. Marco Polo's descriptions of Chinese cities hit medieval Europeans like a vision from another planet. Wide boulevards laid out in perfect grids, bustling markets organized by trade, and canals so clean, he claimed could see fish darting beneath the water. To someone raised in the cramped, winding alleys of Venice or Paris, where sewage ran openly in streets and buildings leaned haphazardly over thoroughfares, these metropolises seemed impossibly orderly. Every street is straight as an arrow, Polo wrote of Hangzhou, marveling at how the city's symmetry made navigation effortless. What Europeans didn't realize was that they were glimpsing a blueprint for urban planning centuries ahead of their time, one that would eventually reshape their own cities. The secret lay in the philosophy behind these grids. Chinese planners didn't just arrange streets for convenience, they designed them as instruments of control and harmony. Polo noted how broad avenues allowed soldiers to quell riots quickly, while uniform blocks simplified tax collection and census-taking. Even more revolutionary was the zoning residential districts separated from commercial hubs, with designated spaces for temples, schools, and hospitals. Compare this to London or Florence, where tanneries spewed foul odors next to bakeries, and it's no wonder Renaissance thinkers seized on Polo's accounts. When Leon Battista Alberti penned his groundbreaking architectural treatise in the 1400s, he explicitly cited Chinese-inspired grids as a model for cities that breathe. But the real shock came when Europeans realized these innovations weren't new. Polo's descriptions matched ancient Roman military camps, proof that China had preserved and refined urban design while Europe forgot it. This revelation fueled a quiet revolution. From Lisbon to Prague, city planners began straightening streets, widening squares, and implementing sewage systems modeled on Chinese examples. The irony, many credited these modern improvements to rediscovered Roman texts, never admitting their debt to Polo's travelogue. Yet the evidence is etched into city maps, like Paris's transformation under Henry Roman IV, whose place des Vosges mirrored the symmetrical plazas Polo described in Quanzhou. Just as these urban designs reshaped Europe's physical landscape, another of Polo's observations was quietly transforming its palette. Nestled between notes on city layouts were tantalizing references to culinary wonders, strange fruits, spices that set the mouth aflame, and a peculiar frozen delicacy the Mongols called milk silk. What sounded like exotic trivia would soon ignite a gastronomic revolution. One of Marco Polo's most delicious and hotly debated revelations was his description of noodles in China, a detail that would later ignite Europe's obsession with pasta. He wrote of wheat dough stretched into long, thin strands, boiled in broth or dried for travel, marveling at how this simple food could sustain entire armies. To Venetian merchants accustomed to heavy breads and porridge, the idea of strings of flour was nothing short of revolutionary. But here's where the controversy begins. Did Polo actually introduce pasta to Italy, or was he simply describing a culinary tradition that already existed? The truth is messier than a plate of spaghetti. While Polo's notes mention Chinese noodles, historical records show that pasta-like dishes were already known in the Mediterranean. Arab traders had brought dried noodles called itri to Sicily as early as the 9th century, and medieval Italian manuscripts reference lasagna and vermicelli long before Polo's travels. Yet his vivid accounts, like watching cooks in Hangzhou pull dough into ribbons as fine as silk threads, undeniably popularized the idea, turning pasta from a regional oddity into a nationwide craze. Food historian Clifford Wright argues that Polo's writings didn't invent Italian pasta, but supercharged its evolution, inspiring chefs to experiment with shapes and sauces far beyond the simple boiled dough of earlier centuries. The Smoking Gun, a 14th century Italian painting showing a bowl of noodles suspiciously similar to those Polo described, complete with chopsticks, a utensil no European would have known without his accounts. Even the word macaroni likely entered Italian through Polo's retelling of the Mongol term mayan, meaning wheat dough, but perhaps the most telling clue is in the backlash. By the 1500s, Italian scholars were fiercely debating Polo's claims, with some dismissing pasta as Mongol trickery, unfit for Christian tables. That very resistance proves how deeply his culinary observations had penetrated European culture. Yet for all the focus on food, Polo's notes held another revelation, one that would reshape how Europe crossed oceans. Just as noodles traveled west, so too did his descriptions of Chinese shipbuilding. Vessels with watertight compartments, retractable sails, and compass-guided navigation. And that maritime technology, it was about to launch a revolution far bigger than any plate of pasta. Marco Polo's jaw-dropping accounts of Chinese treasure ships didn't just impress European sailors, they utterly humiliated them. Picture a Venetian galleon creaking and leaking, bobbing like a cork next to one of these colossal junks. Polo described vessels with 4 towering masts, crews of over 200, and hulls divided into watertight compartments, an innovation that meant even a breach wouldn't sink the ship. To European navigators, this was sorcery. Their own ships, with their single decks and porous seams, were death traps by comparison. Polo's notes gushed about cargo holds stuffed with porcelain and silk, cabins fitted with private gardens, and rudders so massive they required teams of men to steer. But the real game changer, the compass. While European sailors still hugged coastlines, terrified of losing sight of land, Polo watched Chinese navigators glide across open ocean with magnetized needles guiding them. The shockwaves of these revelations took centuries to fully register. At first, European shipwrights dismissed the accounts as exaggeration until Portuguese explorers like Vasco da Gama encountered actual Chinese junks in the Indian Ocean. Suddenly, Polo's descriptions didn't seem so far-fetched. By the 1500s, Iberian shipyards were desperately trying to reverse engineer these designs, leading to hybrids like the Spanish now, which borrowed the junk's sturdier hull construction. Historian Louise Levaithes notes that the iconic European caravel, the workhorse of the age of exploration, owes its segmented bulkheads and sternpost rudders directly to Polo's descriptions. Even the word junk entered European languages through his writings, derived from the Javanese jong, meaning large ship, yet the most telling proof lies in what Europe ignored. Polo also documented China's massive dry docks, where ships were repaired under covered sheds, a system Europe wouldn't adopt until the 1800s. His passing mention of chain pumps for bailing water, dismissed until the Tudor Navy rediscovered them. The bitter irony, While European kingdoms bankrupted themselves building fragile warships, Kublai Khan's navy had mastered durable, efficient transport 3 centuries earlier. But for all the maritime marvels Polo witnessed, one humble detail in his notes would spark an even bigger revolution. Tucked between tales of treasure ships and naval battles was a single line about a black stone that burns, a cryptic clue pointing to something far more valuable than silk or spices. And the secret it held would literally fuel the rise of the modern world. When Marco Polo described the strange, black stones that burned hotter and longer than wood, he wasn't just documenting a curiosity, he was accidentally chronicling the fuel that would power the modern world. These chunks of coal, commonplace in Mongol China, left Polo utterly baffled. They dig these black stones from mountains, he wrote, and when lit, they glow like charcoal but last through the night. To European readers, this sounded like alchemy. In a continent still utterly dependent on forests for fuel, the idea of mining energy from the earth was revolutionary. Polo didn't realize it, but he just handed Europe the key to its industrial future 3 centuries before the first steam engine chugged to life. The real shock wasn't just coal's existence, but how extensively the Mongols used it. Polo described entire cities heated by underground flues pumping hot air from coal furnaces, blacksmiths forging steel in blast furnaces fed by the stuff, and even bathhouses where water was heated with the burning rocks. This wasn't just domestic convenience, it was proto-industrialization on a staggering scale. Historian Kenneth Pomerantz notes that 13th century China's coal consumption per capita wouldn't be matched in Britain until the 1700s. Had Polo's reports been taken seriously, Europe might have leapfrogged its energy crisis centuries earlier. Instead, his accounts were dismissed as tall tales until Elizabethan miners rediscovered coal's potential by accident. Yet Polo's notes contained an even more prescient detail, the environmental trade-offs. He observed how Beijing's winters grew hazier as coal use spread, with residents complaining of bitter air that stings the eyes. This eerie foreshadowing of industrial pollution went unheeded. When Britain eventually embraced coal during its own industrial revolution, it repeated every mistake Polo had documented, from smog-choked cities to deforestation, halted only by switching to fossil fuels. The bitter irony, Europe had to reinvent the wheel Polo had already described. But for all his astonishment at coal's power, Polo saved his real surprise for another social revolution, one unfolding in Mongol China's bustling marketplaces. There, he watched women negotiate deals, manage workshops, and even ride horseback like warriors, roles unimaginable for European noblewomen of the time. His startled description of Kublai Khan's own daughter leading battles would upend medieval gender norms entirely. Marco Polo's observations about Mongol women didn't just surprise his European readers, they outright scandalized them. While noblewomen in Venice or Paris were confined to embroidery and arranged marriages, Polo described Mongol queens commanding armies, widows inheriting entire estates, and daughters choosing their own husbands. His account of Kublai Khan's favorite wife, Chabai, was particularly shocking. She advised the emperor on state affairs, sponsored Buddhist temples, and even intervened in military campaigns. The women here are as bold as the men, Polo wrote, marveling at how they rode horseback astride, hunted with eagles, and negotiated trade deals. To a medieval European audience, this wasn't just exotic, it was an affront to the natural order. So why did these revelations vanish into obscurity for centuries? The answer lies in the uncomfortable truths they exposed. Polo's notes contradicted 2 pillars of medieval European society: the Church's doctrine of female submission and the feudal system's rigid gender roles. When his manuscripts reached Europe, scribes and translators, almost exclusively male clerics, softened or outright erased these passages. A 15th century Latin version replaced Polo's praise of Mongol women's autonomy with a single dismissive line: "The ladies are comely, but kept as is proper." Even the word warrior describing Chabai was changed to noblewoman in later editions. Historian Susan Whitfield uncovered how these edits weren't just censorship. They reflected Europe's inability to reconcile Polo's accounts with their own social hierarchies. The irony, Polo himself was hardly a progressive. His descriptions often carried a tone of bewildered fascination rather than endorsement. Yet the mere act of documenting Mongol gender equality planted dangerous ideas. When Renaissance thinkers like Christine de Pizan later argued for women's education, they secretly drew on Polo's suppressed accounts as proof that alternatives existed. The clues were always there, buried under layers of disbelief and deliberate omission. But while Europe ignored Polo's insights on gender, they obsessed over something far more tangible: his cryptic references to lost treasures. Nestled between tales of warrior queens and bustling markets was a single line that would haunt explorers for centuries, a mention of a hidden valley in the Pamir Mountains where rubies grew like wheat in a field. This wasn't just poetic license. It was a breadcrumb leading to one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. Marco Polo's silence about bringing home treasures is one of history's most tantalizing mysteries. After 24 years in the East, surrounded by Kublai Khan's gold-laden palaces and gem-studded markets, he returned to Venice with no documented hoard of jewels, no chests of exotic artifacts, just his stories and a handful of modest gifts. This glaring absence has fueled wild speculation for centuries. Did Polo hide his wealth to avoid taxes or thieves? Were secret caches of rubies and silks lost at sea? Or, as some theorists dramatically suggest, did the Mongols forbid him from removing their treasures? The truth is far simpler and more revealing. Polo's notes focus almost obsessively on trade routes, currencies, and cultural practices, not personal loot. To him, knowledge was the real treasure. His manuscripts were his fortune, packed with details that would later make Venetian merchants rich. Yet the myth persists because it exposes a cultural blind spot. Medieval Europe couldn't fathom someone valuing information over gold. When Polo described Himalayan valleys where rivers run with gold dust, readers assumed he'd smuggled sacks of it home. His account of Tibetan turquoise mines sparked rumors he wore a cloak lined with the stones. Even his deathbed scene was embellished. Later chroniclers claimed he confessed to hiding a king's ransom beneath his floorboards. But dig into Venetian tax records and you'll find Polo lived modestly by merchant standards. The real giveaway, his will, which bequeaths mundane items like woolen cloaks and a silver belt. No chests of Eastern jewels in sight. This absence speaks volumes about Polo's priorities. While other travelers bragged about stolen relics, he documented the Himalayan cultures he encountered with startling respect. His notes on Tibetan Buddhism, for instance, describe prayer wheels and monastic universities with none of the usual medieval scorn for heathen practices. He even details how Himalayan tribes used yak butter to seal their homes against the cold. A practical tip, not a sensationalized exoticism. That's the real clue hidden in Polo's lack of treasure. His greatest value wasn't in what he took, but in what he chose to preserve. And preservation takes us to his most overlooked revelation, the Himalayan salt mines. Tucked between tales of mountain passes and frozen rivers, Polo describes villages where entire economies revolved around pink salt slabs carved from cliffs. These weren't just seasoning, they were currency traded as far as Babylon. In a world where Europe barely understood mineral wealth beyond silver, Polo was documenting a commodity network centuries ahead of its time. Marco Polo's description of Tibetan sky burials wasn't just a macabre curiosity. It was a window into a spiritual tradition so alien to medieval Europe, it might as well have come from another planet. He wrote of bodies carried to mountaintops where men with knives prepared the deceased to be devoured by birds of the air, to Europeans who buried their dead in consecrated ground with prayers for resurrection. This practice seemed sacrilegious, even demonic. But Polo, to his credit, didn't dismiss it as barbarism. He noted how Tibetans viewed these rituals as acts of compassion, returning flesh to nature in a final act of generosity. They say the soul flies swifter when the body is unburdened, he wrote, capturing the essence of Vajrayana Buddhism's cyclical view of existence, a concept utterly foreign to the linear salvation narrative of Christianity. For centuries, scholars dismissed Polo's account as exaggeration or hearsay. How could a culture treat death with such stark pragmatism? Then, in the 1800s, British explorers confirmed every chilling detail. Sky burials weren't just real, they were sacred, performed by Rajyapa's body breakers who recited mantras as vultures circled. Modern anthropologists now recognize these rituals as ecological masterstrokes, adapting to a land where frozen ground made burial impossible and timber was too scarce for cremation. Polo's notes even hinted at the deeper symbolism, the birds as dakinis, celestial messengers carrying souls to paradise. This wasn't disposal, it was transcendence. Yet the most startling revelation lay in what Polo didn't say. His silence on the Great Wall, a structure so massive, later travelers claimed it was visible from the moon, has baffled historians for generations. How could a man who chronicled everything from Mongol postal stations to Yunnan's marriage customs miss a fortification stretching thousands of miles? The answer, it turns out, is hiding in plain sight. Marco Polo's silence about the Great Wall of China is one of history's most head-scratching omissions. Here was a man who documented everything from Persian postal stations to Sumatran cannibals, yet he never once mentioned the sprawling stone barrier that would later become synonymous with China itself. How could a traveler as meticulous as Polo miss a structure so massive? Later myths claimed it was visible from the moon. The answer isn't as simple as a careless oversight. It's a clue hidden in the very timeline of Polo's journey. When Polo arrived in China in the late 13th century, the Great Wall as we imagine it today, those photogenic, crenellated stone battlements didn't yet exist. The Mongols, masters of open-steppe warfare, saw little value in maintaining the ancient earthen fortifications built by previous dynasties. What remained were crumbling ramparts of packed earth, overgrown with weeds and often repurposed by locals as roads or farmland. To Polo, these remnants might have seemed no different from the ruined Roman walls dotting Europe's landscape. Historian Arthur Waldron notes that the wall's current iconic form was largely built by the Ming dynasty centuries later, long after Polo had returned home. But there's another twist. Polo's original manuscripts may have contained references to the wall that were later edited out. Some scholars point to a cryptic passage in a 14th century copy describing a great barrier of earth and stone near the Mongolian frontier, possibly a scribe's attempt to reconcile Polo's account with growing European legends about China's defenses. The irony, by the time European missionaries like Matteo Ricci visited in the 16th century, the Ming had rebuilt the wall into the imposing structure we know today, making Polo's omission seem even more baffling to later readers. Yet while the wall's absence raises questions, another of Polo's overlooked observations reveals just how closely he was paying attention. Nestled between tales of palace intrigue and desert crossings are meticulous notes on something far more delicate, the dazzling textiles of Asia. His descriptions of cloth that shines like the sun weren't just poetic flourishes, they were precise accounts of advanced silk weaving techniques that would soon revolutionize European fashion. Marco Polo's notes on silk production weren't just travel trivia. They were a smuggled blueprint that shattered one of history's most lucrative monopolies. While European nobles draped themselves in silks worth their weight in gold, Polo was busy documenting every step of the process in China, from mulberry trees cultivated like orchards to the delicate boiling of cocoons to unwind threads, finer than a spider's web. His descriptions were so precise they read like industrial espionage. The exact temperature of water used to soften silk fibers, the wooden reels for spinning, even the secret to breeding moths that produced the whitest threads. For Venetian merchants, these details were a call to action. Why pay exorbitant prices to Arab middlemen when they could replicate the entire process? The fallout was explosive. Within decades of Polo's return, Italian city-states like Lucca and Florence were secretly planting mulberry groves and establishing clandestine silk workshops. By the 1400s, Venice had mastered the art of sericulture so thoroughly that it undercut Byzantine and Persian markets, redirecting the flow of wealth back to Europe. Historian Luca Molla notes that Polo's accounts didn't just describe a technology, they ignited an economic arms race. The once mighty Silk Road, which had funneled Eastern luxuries westward for centuries, began to crumble as Europe stopped being a consumer and became a competitor. Yet the real irony lies in what Polo left unsaid. His notes never explicitly urged Europeans to steal silk technology. He simply reported what he saw with a merchant's clinical eye. The act of rebellion was in the reading. When Venetian guilds pored over his manuscripts, they weren't just learning. They were reverse engineering an empire's crown jewel. And that silent rebellion would pale next to the bombshell Polo dropped on his deathbed, a confession so startling, it would rewrite his entire legacy. As Marco Polo lay dying in 1324, surrounded by priests and notaries, he allegedly made a claim that would haunt historians for centuries. "I did not tell half of what I saw," he whispered, "for no one would have believed me." This deathbed admission wasn't just a dramatic flourish, it was a key to understanding the gaps in his narrative. Why had he glossed over the Great Wall? Why were his descriptions of Japan so vague? The answer, scholars now suspect, wasn't forgetfulness but calculated restraint. Polo knew his audience. In a world where the church burned heretics and rulers punished dissent, some truths were too dangerous to share. Recent forensic studies of his original manuscripts revealed tantalizing clues. Faded ink strokes beneath later scribble edits suggest passages about Mongol court intrigues or religious debates were deliberately softened. One palimpsest even shows a deleted reference to Kublai Khan's skepticism of all organized faith, a detail that would have enraged medieval clergy. Polo's confession, then, wasn't just about omissions, it was about survival. He gave Europe just enough to spark curiosity, but not enough to get himself branded a liar or blasphemer. And so we're left with the ultimate paradox. The man who introduced the West to paper money, coal, and pasta may have taken his greatest discoveries to the grave. What secrets died with him, we'll never know. But perhaps that's fitting for a traveler who spent his life straddling two worlds, always revealing just enough to change history, but never so much that he couldn't slip back into the shadows. Marco Polo's final words, "I did not tell half of what I saw," hang over his legacy like a locked chest at the bottom of the sea. What could possibly have been too shocking, too dangerous, or too unbelievable for even this master storyteller to share? The answer might lie in the shadows of his own manuscripts. Take his fleeting mention of the Valley of Diamonds in India, guarded by snakes so venomous. miners tossed raw meat to distract them while eagles swooped in to snatch the gems. Medieval readers dismissed this as fantasy, yet centuries later, geologists confirmed the existence of Golconda's diamond mines where real life, snakes, likely cobras, did indeed infest the pits. Polo's editors may have trimmed his account to avoid ridicule, but the truth was stranger than the myth. Then there are the glaring silences. Polo spent 17 years in Kublai Khan's inner circle, yet his notes barely whisper about the Mongols' darkest intrigues, assassinations, coups, or the systematic destruction of rival clans. Historians like Maurice Rosabi suspect Polo witnessed far more than he dared record. Imagine what he must have seen: secret war councils plotting invasions, espionage networks spanning continents, or perhaps even the Khan's private struggles with succession. These omissions weren't accidents. In an era when Venetian merchants relied on Mongol goodwill, exposing their brutality could have meant exile, or worse. But the most tantalizing gaps revolve around religion. Polo describes Buddhist miracles with journalistic detachment, like monks who allegedly extended their lifespans through meditation. Yet he never admits whether he believed these claims or if they shook his Christian faith. His manuscript's original copy reportedly contained a lost chapter on the magics of the East, scrubbed by nervous scribes. Fragments survived in obscure dialects, hinting at encounters with yogis who controlled their heartbeats and Persian alchemists claiming to transmute metals. Were these exaggerations? Possibly, but consider this: modern science now validates some of these superstitions, from meditation's health benefits to early chemistry experiments. The true impact of Polo's untold stories isn't just in their mystery, it's in how the fragments we do have rewired the world. His half-told tales of paper money birthed modern finance. His censored notes on Mongol tolerance quietly fueled the Enlightenment. Even his unbelievable descriptions of coal and compasses set the stage for the Industrial Revolution. Every clue, whether whispered or shouted, became a thread in the tapestry of global history. And that's the ultimate lesson. Sometimes the most transformative truths aren't the ones we shout from rooftops, but the ones we bury just deep enough for future generations to dig up. Marco Polo's Journey Notes didn't just describe Asia, they rewrote Europe's future. Those 20 clues, from gunpowder to paper money, weren't mere curiosities. They were seismic shocks that cracked open medieval minds. Think of it this way: before Polo, Europe saw the East as a land of monsters and myths. After his account, it became a map of possibilities, a place where coal could replace forests, where ships sailed by compass, and where cities ran like clockwork. His words didn't just inform, they ignited. When Portuguese caravels finally rounded Africa and Spanish galleons crossed the Pacific, they weren't sailing blind. They were chasing Polo's ghosts, armed with his descriptions of spice markets and silk routes. But the real revolution wasn't just in technology or trade, it was in worldview. Polo's notes forced Europe to confront its own backwardness. Here was a civilization that printed books while scribes still toiled over parchment, that heated homes with coal while Europeans shivered through winters, that tolerated religions while Christendom burned heretics. These weren't just differences, they were challenges to Europe's very identity. No wonder his book became the secret handbook of Renaissance thinkers, from Columbus, who scribbled in its margins, to Mercator, who borrowed its maps. Yet the most enduring legacy lies in what Polo didn't do. He didn't conquer, convert, or colonize. He observed, and in that act of pure curiosity, he forged the first true bridge between East and West. Without his notes, would Da Gama have found India? Would Leibniz have dreamed of cultural exchange? Would Voltaire have championed tolerance? So here's a thought to leave you with. What if Polo's manuscript had molded in some Venetian attic, eaten by rats or lost at sea? Would Europe have clung to its dragons and unicorns for another century? Would the age of exploration have stalled without his clues? The answer isn't just history, it's a mirror. Because every time we dismiss the unfamiliar as fantasy, we risk becoming the medieval Europeans who called polo a liar. And that's the real lesson. The future belongs not to those who fear the unknown, but to those who dare to document it. Now we turn it over to you. How do you think history would have unfolded without Marco Polo's notes? Drop your theories below, and don't forget to subscribe for more journeys into the past's greatest mysteries. After all, the next world-changing clue might be hiding in plain sight.